And it's Friday Live with Byline Times with me, Peter Jukes, our editor, Hardeep Matharu, and our political editor, Adam Bienkov. Now, to be honest, this isn't quite live. No, we're off to WOMAD on Friday, the World Music Festival. So we're recording this on Wednesday. And we're hoping, aren't we all, that it won't be out of date by Friday, 2 nights' time, because things are moving so fast. You know what we're talking about, not the UK elections, but the US elections. We'll be talking in the first half of the program about that. A seismic event, I think, people would agree, in that in the first time ever, so late in the race, an incumbent president has withdrawn when Joe Biden this Sunday withdrew from the race and nominated his vice president, Kamala Harris. We'll be talking about her, the extraordinary revelations, the effect on the Trump and J.D. Vance campaign. That's his running mate, J.D. Vance. And the rise of the Brodigarchs. What a great expression by Carol Cadwallader, a great friend of this paper, has come up describing the tech brothers, the tech bros, and the power of big tech to determine and influence elections. So, but let's go to our sleepless weekend. We were hoping to relax, weren't we, after the festival, after the election, and what happened on Sunday? Who? I think I spotted it first, didn't I?
Well, I mean, it's only been a week and 3 days or so since the attempted assassination on Donald Trump. You know, that really wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, feels like it.
And now, obviously, we have the game-changing move. President Joe Biden has said he will not stand for re-election, and Vice President Kamala Harris is the contender. So it's fair to say potentially everything has changed.
So then we've talked to on our Byline, we have a Byline supplement, a Substack, where we have a lot of American writers. And they were all a bit sort of worried that people wouldn't rally behind Kamala, that it'd all fall apart, look chaotic. Hasn't felt like that since.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of understandable pessimism about the prospect of a Harris, but it seems to have created a huge amount of energy on the Democratic side. The historic amounts of small donations from party supporters, huge amounts of enthusiasm from the party base. And despite her reputation as being not particularly great retail politician, her early stump speeches that she's made have gone down really well. She's had fantastic attack lines against Donald Trump. And I think the problem for the Democrats was that the race was at risk of really slipping away from them over the issue of Biden's health. And even though Harris's poll ratings don't seem to be much better than Biden's, I think there was a real risk that things could really slip away as his health became more and more of an obvious issue over the coming months in the run-up to and it was just impossible for the Democrats to focus the election on anything else other than that single issue. Now it moves firmly back onto the issue of Donald Trump and his competence
and
for
his
the job.
age.
And I don't think we should focus too much on his. I think it was unfair of them to focus on Biden's age. I think it's unfair to focus too much on Trump's age, but certainly on his competence for the job and his own criminality. All of these things that the Democrats were struggling to get a hearing of just last week, they can now firmly focus on. And of course, Harris, as a former lawyer herself, a prosecutor, is ideally placed to prosecute Donald Trump over the course of this campaign. And even though Trump is still, I think, the favourite, I think that Harris has got a real fighting chance of winning this election. It's all about what happens in those swing states, because the national polls don't really tell us a huge amount. It's whether or not her candidacy just adds loads more votes in places like California, or whether it actually sort of moves the dial in those swing states, and we just don't know that yet.
I'm going to get back more on her campaign style with Hardeep in a moment, but just on that polling, you made a point that the current polling, up until that moment, it would shift massively because she's been buried. You know, the vice president doesn't get much of showing. And I think Ipsos already had some polls in from yesterday showing her
slightly up, yes.
Slightly up, from better than Biden.
Yes.
So let's go to that campaigning style. I mean, she did exactly as you said, Adam. She mentioned the fact, I prosecuted fraudsters. I prosecuted sex offenders. I know Donald Trump. I know where it's coming from. A great line. And then this other great line I thought she did with quite surprising energy, because I don't really know that much about her. I don't suppose any of us do. not going back. We're not going back, which seems like one of those 3-word phrases like, yes, we can, or take back control, or build the boat, or stop the boats, or build the wall. That's quite powerful.
Yes, and I think she can is in a good position to focus on issues like abortion, which is a massive issue in the States. And if she can, I think the challenge for Harris is to kind of reform that coalition of voters that Barack Obama managed to form, which is women voters, metropolitan voters, and also some white voters as well. And he was able to successfully manage that. Harris, I think it's going to be harder for her. I think if she can get Obama back on the campaign trail, and if she can focus on the issue of abortion, on the issue of Donald Trump's criminality, and the fact that the US economy is actually in a really good position. And you would expect ordinarily for an incumbent after one term with the economy doing really well by all sort of international standards to be in a very good position to win this election. So the fact that Biden was behind quite significantly in all of the swing states suggests that he was dragging down the ticket quite a bit. So it remains to be seen whether she's able to turn that around.
So just on dragging down the ticket, I want to get to the energy and the sort of potential coalition that Harris is accruing, because obviously a good point about women voters, Roe versus Wade being overturned, and their rights to reproductive rights, access to reproductive health care, but also voters of color, Indian and black backgrounds.
Latinos as well.
And
Latinos as well, who have swung towards the Republicans in recent years.
And they could swim back to her. That's very interesting. Just before we get to that, though, let's look at what we discussed, which is Biden. It is clear, and it was clear to us, I think we mentioned this the last episode, that when we spoke to people in New York, as a symbolic figure, even though they didn't want to vote for Trump, they felt he was younger and more vigorous than Biden. Because it's the head of state, it's a symbol of the president, whatever they've got up to is in itself important. You were but quite despairing this time last week and thought Trump's going to win it. How do you feel about Biden's resignation? Well, whatever it is, passing on the torch. What do you feel about it?
I think it is potentially a game changer. And for me, the reason why I think it has been such an enthusiastic moment, there's so much energy, is because on a symbolic level, and I think America is a country that lives and thrives on these big narratives about itself and its past and its future. I think Kamala Harris now being Trump's rival sets the stage for a real good versus evil sort of battle ahead. And I think in a way that emphasizes how high the stakes are. So as you say, Peter, this notion that looking forward and not going back versus people who want to undermine the very foundations on which the entire American democracy and the republic is built on, i.e. taking them back. And so there's a sense with Kamala coming onto the scene that America really is at a crossroads. This is really serious. It's about whether America remains as a democracy or not. And while Biden was someone who spent a lot of his campaigning projecting that message, I just didn't feel that it resonated beyond a certain point.
Didn't embody it.
It wasn't embodied. And Kamala Harris is a woman of color. She is young. She's beautiful. She's strong. She's a former prosecutor. She's many things in one. And I would argue probably embodies in a very visceral way the future of America. You know, the country's becoming much more diverse. There is, people care that Roe versus Wade was overturned. This notion of progressive rights being rolled back. I think she does represent a sense of the future. I don't think if she gets elected, all of the problems go away. I don't think that means that the MAGA movement and those currents that are there in American politics suddenly disappear overnight. But I do think in a way that Biden couldn't, she really represents something. And I think at least the people who end up voting for her and the Democratic Party, whatever happens, will be able to say we gave it a real fight. We gave it a real good shot. And I think that is important for democracy. There was a notion that Biden, just by being the president and all of, and he was vice president for Barack Obama, someone who had spent a long time in politics, also as a senator, and he's just coming to the end of the road politically. And the fire had gone out of him. And I think it is important for democracy, especially American democracy, at the point it's at, that people see that it's being fought for. And I do think she encapsulates that. And I do think she's pretty cool as well. And generationally, people will relate to her in a way it's a completely different vibe, as young people like to say, than Donald Trump.
We'll get back to the generational distance and TikTok and brat. And I want Adam to think in a moment, about what are the forces against her being a woman and being a woman of color. But just going back to Biden, it is quite extraordinary, isn't it, where we talk about a change candidate, right? So that's what Kamala is saying, no going back. And oddly enough, Trump is the past, right? He has been. Now, what Trump did with his vice president was try to get him strung up during the insurrection, failing to give up power. The impossible transmit. If democracy is about the succession of power, Trump refused to pass the baton on. Whereas Biden has sacrificed himself and passed the baton on. And that itself is quite extraordinary, don't you think? And they never want to give up power. Blair didn't want to leave. Trump didn't want to leave. Nobody ever wants to leave that position as a powerful president.
Yeah, I think that is symbolic and important in that way. Of course, we don't know how thrilled Biden was about this decision. So, whether he did it all that willingly. But I also think for his legacy, as we've said, he's spent such a long time in political life. To also be the person who allowed a second Trump presidency would also have been quite a big thing. That would have been left with him as a politician, as a statesman, as an American. And I'm not sure, and I think he made that calculation that actually, that's not for the good of the country, and that will be on his head. But yes, again, the parallel with Keir Starmer and the government of service, this notion that you cannot put yourself before the country, I think that will resonate with a lot of people. And there is a sense, there was a beautiful moment where Kamala Harris was giving one of her first sort of campaign speeches. And I think Joe Biden was dialed in on the phone. Yeah, and it's just really lovely. And he was saying, I'm watching you, kid. I'm watching you. I love you. And there is a sense that he is passing the baton on, not only for the sake of American democracy, but also Kamala Harris is a woman and a woman of color. And I think there is a sense of him understanding the significance of that.
So, Adam, because you know about the polling on this, it's often said, I remember a close American friend of mine said, when Dukakis and Jesse Jackson was running for president, this shows how old I am, in the 80s, Americans will not elect a black man to the presidency in my lifetime. Now, my friend, a very good friend, was completely wrong, because in 2008 they elected Barack Obama. But there was a choice then, and it was quite a tough internecine battle between there being the first woman president and the first president of color, and they chose the Republican Party, the Democratic Party chose Obama. Wouldn't somebody say, if you're looking at this from a cynical rather than a skeptical angle, what are the Democrats doing? They're sort of going to annoy two sets of voters, misogynists and racist.
Well, there obviously is a sort of a long history of racism in America and a long history of misogyny as well, and so that is a potential challenge in some states and in some parts of the country among some voters. But it can also, there's another side to it. It can also hope to mobilise voters, women voters, voters of colour as well. So I think sometimes we overestimate the extent to which these sort of identity issues can influence a vote. I mean, the fact that Hillary Clinton didn't win in the past, I think was partly to do with sexism, I'm sure, but it was also because she was a deeply unpopular political figure.
And she was a Clinton. It seemed like another dynasty.
And she had a past, and she was seen as being part of the past, and Trump was seen as representing more of the future. That's less the case this time around. I don't think that's going to be the deciding factor in this race. I think it is going to come down to a contest between the two potential candidates. Obviously, it's going to have an impact in some parts of the country among some voters, but I don't think that's going to be the defining factor, personally.
What they say is the defining factor is because they actually have quite low turnouts, American presidential registered voters. I think it's like 50, 60%. I mean, ours has been low recently, but we had 70%. It's all about turnout because there's more registered Democrats than there are Republicans. If they're unhappy with the candidate, they sit on their hands and stay at home.
And it's that enthusiasm factor. So there is a massive enthusiasm factor on the Republican side.
On the Democrats?
On the Republican side, for
yeah.
Donald Trump. I mean, we saw that in the wake of his assassination attempt,
Right, yes.
and the Republican convention. The huge amounts of enthusiasm there is among Trump voters, which there just wasn't for Biden on the other side. That does seem to have been mirrored now with Harris, and there is that huge wave of donations and interest, and particularly among younger voters for Harris. And I think that's a crucial factor in the Democrats being able to win this time is actually getting some of that enthusiasm, giving voters within their own coalition a motivation to get out and vote that isn't just about voting against Donald Trump, but actually giving people a candidate who they can actually feel enthusiastic about. And I think the signs are already, although there's still a long way to go, that there is a lot of that enthusiasm for Harris that there wasn't for Biden.
So Act Blue, which is the donor system for Democrats, where they got 100 million was donated, wasn't it, about a day and a half, and volunteers coming forward. Hardeep, just we talked briefly before I want to look at the Trump campaign and the selection of his running mate, J.D. Vance, but just a little bit more of the memography of Kamala, because I'm seeing all these sort of bright green memes and TikToks of her laughing. Well, some people try to use it disparagingly, her laugh, that Republicans do, like it's a cackle. But I find it quite engaging. Is she engaging? Is there signs she's engaging that whole new world of TikTok and the youth electorate?
Yeah, I think in a similar way to Barack Obama, there's an iconography developing around Kamala Harris, but like in much faster time. So people from the worlds of pop culture, like Charlie XCX, who I'm not even that familiar with, has called her Brat, not a brat, but Brat.
What does that mean?
It apparently means a sense a woman has of acting in a way that may not please other people. They can think what they like, but this is what I'm going to do for my own advocacy and who I am. So that there's been that. Kerry Washington, famous actress, also posted to her Instagram page a dancing sort of video saying she's with Kamala Harris. So I think she does activate in a way Obama did that world of arts and culture. We've talked before about the Republican convention. I think Adam will be having a chat this week about the sort of music performances that were happening there.
Kid Rock and Hulk Hogan ripping his shirt off, and it's just extraordinary. I've never seen anything like
they're
that.
very different look, and if we're talking about memes and vibes, very different sort of feel. And it does, I have to say, look older and sort of more middle of the road. And what is this? Whereas Kamala does activate all of that. And I think that's not a bad thing. It engages people. But what on her laugh, for example, there's a clip of her doing the rounds from an interview a while ago saying, I know people make fun of my laugh, but I get my laugh from my mother. And I remember all these brilliant Indian women sitting around in the kitchen drinking coffee, telling stories and laughing from their stomach. That's where my laugh comes from. And I think and she said, the reason I'm saying this is there shouldn't be something in our society where people are told they need to be a certain way, even about laughing in a certain way. There is something about her, I think, that because
she's quite likable, isn't she?
Yeah, she has so many different elements to her. And
Cooking.
I think she's
a great cook, apparently,
it's interesting,
too.
you know.
She's done a whole cookery show. And that, you're right, you have the culture world of Hulk Hogan and golf with Donald Trump and Kid Rock and this kind of American culture. It's American culture.
It is, yeah.
But then you have this other, more R&B style of culture, Indian cooking. This
Two
kind
Americas.
of fusion. Yeah. So the key thing on those swing states will be who her running mate is, her vice presidential, and the various governors, very powerful. Very interesting that we had an editorial meeting explained to us, didn't we? Or actually our supplement meeting, how many good Democrat governors there, Democratic Party governors, particularly in those swing states like Pennsylvania. And so she'd probably take a nominee. A running mate would be somebody a little more conventional and white.
Midwestern white man.
Yeah, to cover the bases. So that takes us to the rather extraordinary choice of Donald Trump. Now, as you pointed out, I didn't sit through it. It's the job of our political editor to sit through things like the Republican National Convention. I'm too old for that stuff. But That's when they announced Vance, and it was very, you both saw bits of it. It seemed very controlled, seemed very positive, even if we might not like their agenda, and organized, and Donald Trump seemed quite tamed in control. Would that be fair, that he seemed on focus?
And it's our kind of first real look at Vance, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name. He was an interesting pick. We're talking about sort of running mates. What they bring to the ticket. He doesn't really bring a whole lot to the ticket. He doesn't. He's a relatively sort of inexperienced politician. He doesn't bring over a section of the vote that Trump wouldn't have won anyway, or any states that he wouldn't have won anyway. And I think he was picked to please the base, and at a point when Trump thought that he had the election in the bag because of Biden and the questions over his health. And there has been some reporting this week that there are some regrets now on the Trump leadership team about having picked Vance, because he's quite an awkward speaker.
He made some very awkward jokes about, everything you say is racist. It's actually bombed. It was, I think, in his first speech in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, he badly bombed.
But he says, I suppose I drink Mountain Dew. I suppose that's racist too. And this awkward silence. I love you guys, he said. I think he's making a joke about Dew and Jew. I can't imagine, whatever it is, it's not.
I'm not
funny.
sure what he was, but he just seems really awkward, and I'm not. I think inauthentic is what really comes across. And of course, he famously was a massive critic of Trump in the past. Compared him to Hitler, and so now to suddenly convert into this sort of MAGA Trump-loving politician, it just comes across as really inauthentic. And I think that comes across in his speaking style as well.
And he's he was kind of a Democrat. He comes from a Rust Belt state. He says there's a hillbilly. There are some questions about that. There's a movie about him. But he did say in 2016, he thought that Trump was a sex offender. He thought he was like Hitler. He was a joke. And all that stuff is resurfacing, which is amazing. The Trump campaign didn't think that it would.
And he's vehemently anti-abortion. And that's going to really play into the Democrats' hands as well. And he said some deeply damaging things about international affairs, which obviously isn't a massive issue in US elections. But it's, again, questions about his judgment, the things he said about the UK and being
controlled by Islamists.
And his questions about Ukraine, his comments about Ukraine as well. None of these may not cost Donald Trump the election, but they don't add anything to the ticket either.
Well, the rumor is, it's a rumor, and obviously people want to sow this kind of information that Donald Trump is having second thoughts. And he can dump him, he can get another one. But why did he take him, Hardeep? I mean, the reporting is, it's a known fact that J.D. Vance is a kind of creature or a kind of acolyte of Peter Thiel, who's the big tech, very far right wing, I'd say. And I think say that looking at his statements, hyper-libertarian, South African born, I think, tech funder of both Palantir, started PayPal, was the original board of Facebook. And he sort of nurtured him. And who came on board after the assassination attempt? It seems like years ago now, doesn't it? But everybody piled on board. You have the flag. It's like Iwo Jima. And that night, Elon Musk, the owner of X, the owner of Tesla and SpaceX, comes online. So I'm endorsing Donald Trump, his kind of hero moment. And I'm donating 45 million a month to 45 million, to a super PAC for him. He's now said he's not doing that. And that all that sort of tech backing seems to be going a bit wrong, because this was a strategy which made sense when they thought that Biden was on the ropes. So, I mean, does that shock you, either of you? So the role, we're on this platform, right? It's supposed to be a neutral platform, and it's actually controlled by someone who's changing emojis, changing things to suit his candidate, Donald Trump. Do you find this extraordinary?
I mean, I think J.D. Vance, I think potentially is problematic now for the Republican Party. I mean, we've heard some early comments. Well, I'm not sure he said them recently, actually. I think it was from a while back about people like Kamala Harris, women who don't have children. She's a stepmother.
Cat lady.
She doesn't have a biological children.
I think he said this on Fox not so long ago.
So long ago. She's a miserable cat lady who doesn't like her life because she doesn't have children, and therefore people like her don't have a stake in America. So there's that sort of stream which plays to the MAGA base.
Just on the women thing, there was Janie Godley. So the Scottish comedian made the point, there's no president that's ever given birth to a child. And a lot of them and also the birther thing's beginning to come out, isn't it?
Yeah, this notion of her background. I mean, extraordinarily in the UK, Nigel Farage referred to Kamala Harris as a black African woman. That her mother was from India, and I believe that her father was from the Caribbean.
Yes.
Jamaican. So, and she's African American is how you'd refer to her. I'm not sure why black African woman. But the point, Vance is interesting because, so there's those streams, as Adam's reported on, these comments about London being the UK being the first truly Islamic country.
With a nuclear weapon. I think
he
could have been joking, couldn't he? But it wasn't.
It didn't seem like it. But
I mean, I think it was a joke, but it was still, why would you make that joke about an ally?
Why? Yeah.
And
very strange.
And completely wrong.
Yeah, so there's that stream. Then there's his background, which you both discussed. Very interesting. 2016, writing for The Atlantic. Donald Trump is cultural heroin. Might make you feel good to vote for him in the short term, but he doesn't address any of the real problems of working class America. Very, very interesting essay. I think the paywall has gone on that, so would encourage people to read it. And yeah, Yale educated lawyer, married to a woman of color, very religious, converted to Catholicism. So he has this sort of interesting journey, I think, that Trump probably thought would appeal to a lot of working class Americans. But actually, as is with the case with Trump, the other side of the story is that he's got this backing from Silicon Valley. Millionaires. And he is very much their creature. And people like Musk, Thiel, they are concerned about the US government's response to crypto, to AI, to regulation. TikTok was unexpectedly quite a prominent bit of policy recently. So they are concerned and they want their interests to be taken care of. And but the totality of it is Vance just seems quite an odd choice. I mean, doesn't have much political experience at all, only been a senator a very short amount of time. And as you both say, everybody knows that he was calling Donald Trump sort of cultural heroin in 2016 and now is his running mate. It doesn't come across as authentic. So
it's people might wonder why we talk so much about American politics. It is because two reasons. It is still the world's superpower, and famously, when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. And given the policies of both Trump and Vance, it would have strategic impact on NATO and the war in Ukraine against Putin. So this is very much it impacts on us. But also culturally, I think it's very interestingly, they know a bit about our culture. We do speak the same language. That's famously divided by it. But that's not quite true. There are a lot of things in common. A lot of British politicians, including Liz Truss, Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, go over there. They come over here to visit the Queen or the King in this case. And just on that level of the importance of American culture and its sort of universalism, the way it's pumped out, we have, for members now on Byline Audio, all 6 episodes of Americana, which is Hardeep and Bonnie exploring some of those icons. What is there? There's The Godfather, there's the O.J. Simpson trial.
Yeah. Citizen Kane, Watergate.
MAGA. And James Baldwin. So that's all available. If you go on Byline Audio now, you get it without adverts, an extra section with us, all 3 of us. I join them in the diner after their trips to these various institutions. But it is important to keep an eye on American politics. It seems like this summer is going to be dominated by it, just as we were going to relax.
Yeah, and UK politics will. I think the Conservative, just to talk briefly about.
We're going to go back to UK politics now, don't worry.
The Conservative leadership contest is due to finish 2 days before the US election. I mean, the idea of anyone's going to be paying any attention to the UK, to the Conservative Party leadership election at that point, I think is for the better. Really.
But it's very interesting you raise that, Adam. There is more connection between the current British Conservative Party and the American Republican Party than is Labour and the Democrats, isn't there? There used to be quite a close alliance. Blair and Clinton got on. Gordon Brown was always teaching at the Kennedy School. But we know 2 former prime ministers were out of the RNC. So do you think if Trump is up or down, that might affect the Conservative race.
We have seen this strange development in the past few years of Conservative politicians almost being more concerned with winning the support of US Republicans than they are about British voters. I mean, Liz Truss as well, even after being kicked out of office and out of Parliament, she's still spending time out there trying to sort of win over the support of the MAGA base. That's definitely a big new development.
She was on Fox News, I think, last night or this morning, saying, Kamala was not competent in her office as vice president, as the most incompetent prime minister we've ever had, as far as I know. She would understand incompetence, I guess. This is me dropping any mask.
And they're all fighting for the attention and endorsement of Trump, and and so much of the reporting in this country has been about has Farage met Trump? Did Johnson? Did people turn out to see Johnson, etc., etc.? Of really little relevance to. I mean, their relationship with Trump is of little relevance to us, but it does seem to be focusing a huge amount of attention.
And we wonder why that is. My guess is that the cameras there were interested in it anyway, but in terms of Johnson, who's photographed the famous thumbs up with Trump, wasn't he? Farage didn't apparently get to see him, even though he travelled all the way to sort of reassure him after he hurt his ear. There's no pictures of them together in any golden lifts. Is the money, isn't it? There's a lot of money in American politics. There's these super PACs worth hundreds of millions. And I suppose, all these speaking tours, when they go on these, they get paid for them.
There's a lot of money. It's a lot of attention. I think the difficulty they'll find is that the vast majority of Americans in general, but certainly Republicans in particular, have very little idea who these people are. Particularly Liz Truss. I mean, how many Republicans have the slightest clue of that she was prime minister for 4 weeks or whatever it was a couple of years back?
There was a funny, did we play this last time? No, I think we just played it to ourselves. Bonnie Greer posted this series of interviews from the RNC and asking people, Liz Truss. And then one guy, Liz Truss, what's that?
Yeah, he's very disturbed by it. What's that? He's very confused. Like, what's that?
Yeah, so he was a black guy with a tall Lincoln hat because the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, which was seen as one of the abolish slavery. It's sort of moved on a bit now. So I suppose from all the razzmatazz and tall hats and fun of the American elections, we should move back to another week in the UK Parliament. Adam, you've been there. We talked about the state opening last week. Now, slightly back to normal. Prime Minister's question time. Rebellions, the grind of daily politics. How's it been for the second week, I suppose, of the Labour government?
Yeah, well, I think the Prime Minister's questions, Keir Starmer's first Prime Minister's questions, I think pretty much sets the tone of where we are at the moment, which is fairly unremarkable. No real difficulties for Keir Starmer. Rishi Sunak sort of playing the part as a sort of elder statesman, trying to sort of resurrect his reputation, being very conciliatory, asking very easy questions of the Prime Minister on Ukraine, along the lines of, do you support Ukraine? And Keir Starmer does want to support Ukraine. But there have been some difficulties for Keir Starmer this week, particularly over the issue of the two-child benefit cap. He suffered his first rebellion of this Labour government on Tuesday evening.
How many rebels were there, Adam?
Well, there were 7 Labour MPs who voted against. There were a couple of dozen further who abstained. But in advance of the vote, Labour MPs, potential Labour rebels, were warned by Labour whips that if they voted in favour of the SNP amendment to scrap the two-child benefit cap, that they would lose the whip. Now, that's quite an extraordinary threat to make. In the past, votes on Queen's speeches, King's speeches, have not been treated as matters of confidence. Even under the last Conservative government, that wasn't the case. The only sort of comparable point that you can look at is when Boris Johnson treated his vote on his Brexit plans in 2019 as a vote of confidence, and 21 Conservative MPs were suspended from the party. So it's quite an extraordinary.
They were kicked out. I mean, people like
I think some ended up were a little bit back in before the general election. But yes, it ended.
So those 7 MPs. So how many abstentions were there?
There were 42 Labour MPs who didn't vote. Not all of those will have been abstentions. Right. But I spoke to some of the MPs who abstained, and they were really quite angry about the sort of treatment that they'd faced. Because this is an issue where actually there is a huge amount of agreement within the Labour Party. This isn't a kind of left versus right issue. Actually, people like Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister, made a big intervention in the run-up to general election, saying that the party needed to scrap the cap. Keir Starmer in the past has said that he wants to scrap the cap. Left, centre, right MPs all agree that it's been hugely damaging. It's forced hundreds of thousands of children into poverty. And Labour have been in the sort of the day before the vote said they were still considering scrapping the cap. And I think ultimately they may well end up taking that position at the budget. But to have suffered this rebellion and to have taken such an extreme measure against the rebels when the Labour Party has such a huge majority in the House of Commons.
Unlike Boris Johnson, it was close.
Yeah.
He kept on losing votes.
I mean, if 7 Labour MPs vote against on a matter of principle, it's not going to threaten. I don't think the chances of Keir Starmer suffering any parliamentary defeats over the course of this parliament is pretty slim.
So it's symbolic. So the abstentions, no punishment for them. They probably won't get a front. I suppose none of them were ministers or on the front bench.
No.
And then the vote with the SNP, they get. Is that permanent suspension of the whip, or is that just like it's?
No, so they've been given. It's actually a slightly strange arrangement. They've been told they're going to be suspended for 6 months, and their behaviour will be assessed after that period. So I don't know if that means they're expected to follow the whip while they haven't got the whip. It doesn't really make a huge amount of sense.
So this is obviously a symbolic battle. This is the French say "pour encourager les autres," to encourage the others. Beating will happen until people pay attention, and it's backfiring. I mean, this is obviously, a sign we're not going to. It was clearly flagged up as an issue which the government was going to be pressurised over, and they're saying this is what happens if you try that on.
I think it was a couple of things going on. It's an early sign saying we're not going to tolerate dissent, and it's also I think there are people around Keir Starmer who are quite kind of factionally obsessed on beating up on the left. And the 7 Labour MPs who ended up voting against are all strongly associated with the Jeremy Corbyn wing of the party.
Yeah.
So I think it follows on from what we saw prior to the general election campaign when we had the attempt to oust Diane Abbott as well, and some Faiza Shaheen as a candidate. So I think that's
Diane Abbott didn't vote or didn't join these.
No, she didn't. She either abstained or she wasn't able to.
And Dawn Butler on the left, who we know well, also didn't vote against. So it's quite interesting, maybe divide and rule there. Just to be clear on it, it's not about a cap on child benefit. Is it about the third child? It's the universal credit.
It's universal credit and tax credits.
Tax credits.
Family tax credits.
So that could be worth a lot of money. And
the studies that have been done on this show that it is the single biggest driver of new people going into child poverty, and the areas where the poverty rate has gone up the most are in areas where there are much higher percentages of large families, and by large families I mean more than 2 children.
And this Chancellor justification for not doing this was they didn't have the money. Well,
it's not even that they don't have the money; it's that they haven't identified where the money is coming from.
Right.
I think it's very possible, if not likely, that when we get to the first budget, that the money is found. As I say, there is a huge amount of agreement on getting rid of this cap. I think the Starmer leadership sort of decided to make this as a kind of totemic issue, as a kind of showing that we're willing to stand up to the left of the party, and we're willing to be fiscally responsible. I think that, particularly from Reeves and from the Treasury, I think that's the sort of thinking behind it. And I don't think it's going to have a negative impact, as I say, on his and how some will fare in Parliament, because of the size of the Labour majority is so large.
And sadly, it's not. A lot of people feel it's unfair that this. Unfortunately, the polling shows it's not. Even though it's ridiculous policy, that people feel it's going to just. People shouldn't have more.
Well, I think the polling does. I mean, depending on what question you ask, it does show that people are sort of support the idea of the cap in principle, a sort of narrow majority. But this isn't really this is about the morality of it and about the actual effectiveness of this cap. Is it just driving people into other? Is it actually a net cost keeping the cap, because it forces people into other services? It puts extra strain on the NHS, on schools, on social services. But I think it is a potential problem if Labour does go down this line of taking a very hard line against its kind of left flank. we saw what already happened in the general election when we saw the rise of independent candidates, the rise of the Green Party, which is now in second place in 39 seats across the country at the last general election. If they carry on down this line of looking like they just want to sort of beat the left at every turn, then you could see, particularly after sort of 5 years of a Labour government, a real rise of progressives sort of deserting the party towards other left parties. And if at the same time the Conservatives are under a new leader are doing better, then the next general election could end up looking a lot closer than it currently looks likely to be.
So Hardeep, the immediate support of these 7 rebels, if you like, lost the whip by Jeremy Corbyn. So there is that question, isn't there? Is that are these old battles playing out? What do you make of that and strategy? I mean, I suppose Corbyn got a lot of blue wall votes, or is it two sides sort of having a symbolic battle, so laying down the sort of marks before we go on our summer recess, and that will come back and it will seem somewhat irrelevant?
I always find it really odd because I always find there's for me a disconnection between this discipline and control that comes centrally from, it appears, the people who are surrounding and advising the Prime Minister, versus Keir Starmer and the type of politician he projects himself as, which I think is fair to say he probably is. I find that is very disconnected. So even this notion that 7 people have had the Labour whip suspended for 6 months, I think it is actually quite drastic on an issue, poverty, which you could understand why left-wing Labour politicians would want
not
to...
Not just leftists, Adam.
Not just Suella Braverman as well. Supports this scrapping of the limit. You could understand why they might want to vote against that particular point, because for them it's a point of morality or conscience. So it does seem to be a bit of a drastic issue to do this over. But for me, there is still a disconnect between, is this... Starmer doesn't, for me, seem to embody the type of politician who would naturally want to do that, to be frank. I do agree with both of you that it is symbolic. And I think it is trying to send a very strong signal to the country that we're going to be disciplined. We're not going to spend our time in internal fights between the Labour Party. The Labour Party is united. We're in control. We're very stable. You can now trust us with the economy. The Jeremy Corbyn days are far behind us. I think all of that, Starmer or his team or all of them have judged that to be of such importance to almost win the trust of the public on those issues. But as Adam says, by doing that with a certain cohort, there's a whole load of other people who feel the country really needs transformational change, not just tinkering and these notions of, well, we've got to be fiscally responsible, but also people want change. You're going to have to give them something on that.
What I think is interesting about this row is it kind of has refocused the idea of this battle in the Labour Party being between the left and the right, or the left and the centre. Actually, when you look at what Keir Starmer has done, what was in the King's speech, everything that he's said and done over the course of the past few weeks since he became Prime Minister, it's actually shifted politics to the left quite significantly. This is a much more left-wing programme than I think his critics on the left are willing to admit. And so to create this row, or allow this row to happen, which kind of puts him on the wrong side of that argument, when actually I think, when he says he wants to end child poverty or massively reduce child, I think that's right. But they've managed to engineer a situation where, and I think it also exposes the sort of real divide in the Labour Party. It's not really about left and right, because I think there's a huge amount of agreement in the party. But whereas Starmer is, I think the Starmer government is quite much further to the left than most previous Labour governments. I think there is a kind of divide on the sort of authoritarian and liberal side of the argument, whereas actually Labour is this Labour government is far left, but it's not a particularly liberal government, and Starmer's priorities are not particularly. I think as a former DPP, he's had very little to say about protest rights, for instance. So I think that could potentially become a real kind of sticking point over the course of this.
So we've noticed that it hasn't been like Blair in many ways. The nationalisation of the rails. Actually, some of immediate change of policies towards Gaza and Israel. But there was a thing in the Blair government, wasn't it? Especially under Blunkett, they were communitarians, which allowed them to be strong and as both tough on the cause of the crime, as well, and tough on crime itself.
And they also had a lot more money, which is the other big difference between this government and Blair's government.
So maybe that's a lowering expectations. It's very interesting that we made the analogy with what Johnson did to the rebels on the left or the One Nations Party. But of course, maybe this is a factor we're not excusing, we're just analysing. Because obviously it's a complicated situation. You can't simply take sides either way. That you had for 3 years under Theresa May, the running saw, I can call it, of the ERG. You had this group which was constantly working together, trying to disrupt and push its own agenda. Maybe that's what they just don't want to have this group developing within the Labour Party.
But I think the problem is when you've got such a large majority as Starmer has, you do need some opposition, even if it's only internal opposition. Because when you don't have that scrutiny opposition, then you do end up with a government that makes bad decisions. That's the risk.
And also it's about how the Labour Party has always been seen. It's always been, the broad church, it's always been seen as pluralistic within itself. A lot of people who believe in progressive politics, who may disagree on the exact policies and the role of capitalism, but it's always seen in that broad way. And people would argue it works best when it has a collective moral mission that everyone's working towards in their own ways. And I think in that sense, it is different from the Conservatives. The Conservatives are seen as ruthless, aren't they? As you said before, Peter. I mean, not so much now, but have been historically in the past, which is, in a way, why the Cummings, Johnson exodus of all those MPs, you could still understand it because that's what the party does to maintain power. Whereas the Labour Party, it is seen as different. It's seen as representing something different within politics. And I think this is what Zara Sultana, one of the MPs who's been suspended, who voted for the amendment, she was saying, for me, this is Labour is about having a moral mission. And she was asked, well, you've just won a re-election as a Labour MP, and the election manifesto didn't have anything about scrapping the two-child limit. And she said, no, it didn't, but it had helping to eradicate poverty as one of its aims. And so that's the ticket I stood on.
Just put a counterpoint to that. If you really wanted to eradicate poverty, they're setting up a unit, you wouldn't just sort of rebel and create moral grandstanding with votes. You do something, join a cabinet, work hard to make sure your party gets the power.
But I think all governments have rebellions. Tony Blair's government had rebellions. Boris Johnson's, you can tolerate that, especially when you've got such a large majority. What harm would it have done for him to have accepted that there was and to accept the rebellion, and then in a couple of months' time or whenever this review comes out or the budget happens, to put the measures in place which actually meet the concerns they have.
That's why it doesn't ring true.
So I think something else has happened.
And I also think this point you make, Adam, we should come back to it and explore it more in Byline Times. This notion of authoritarianism, I mean, it's a big term, and I know we're using it in a very specific context. But even before the election, many concerns were raised with us and obviously other publications about the level of control from the team around Starmer towards left-wing
selecting candidates.
So there's this authoritarian element around maintaining control.
And it can lead to bad decisions. I mean, when we look at Johnson's government and try and trace where it started to go badly wrong, I think it does go back to that time when he expelled the kind of centre-left or centre-ground of his party over Brexit. That's, I think, the beginning of the end of the Conservative government that became much less of a centre-ground party because he won on a kind of sort of unity ticket, Boris Johnson.
But what if, I just imagine...
then took it in a very different direction when he was challenged over Brexit.
I'm just wondering, what if there is other things going on? We'll find out and we'll investigate because we're going to get to Murdoch and what happened there with the meetings. That there was because a lot of left-wing MPs abstained and there was, look, we can't do it now, bide your time, we'll do it, in a year or so's time. And to distinguish themselves, I must say, I see this on the left, whether you count me the left wing, I don't know, but there is often left-wing groups want to distinguish themselves from other left-wing groups. And so it feels like there's something else going on. But it is worth bearing in mind that under Blair, as you well point out, Jeremy Corbyn was a member all that time. He rebelled like 200 times. Or how many
and Blair had key left-wing figures in his own cabinet as well, which Starmer does not.
And he had Dennis Skinner on the backbench there all often. So yes, pluralism is important early days yet. So let's go to this other big story, which really you broke it, Adam, because you pushed it. There had been reports that there had been several meetings between Starmer and representatives of News UK, including a summer party with Rupert Murdoch, definitely meetings with Rebecca Brooks, the CEO, and that the original reporting had said he was pressed. I think Trevor Kavanagh said this. Actually, this was reported by Kelvin McKenzie, wasn't it? So not the most reliable source.
There were a number of reports, I think.
Okay, but Kelvin McKenzie, who was the Sun editor who wrote The Truth, and he wrote Lies About Hillsborough, said that Starmer refused to concede to any of the demands, and so there was a sort of lukewarm endorsement. Then further reports, pick the story up there from there, Adam.
Yeah, so the newspaper reported this week that because Labour ended up getting a very late endorsement from this after a long time when I think both sides were suggesting that an endorsement wasn't going to come. In fact, that's what Kevin piece reported originally, that the papers weren't going to endorse Labour. There was a very late endorsement from the Sun and from the Sunday Times, but there wasn't an endorsement from the Times. And in the Times leader, in lieu of an endorsement, was suggesting that the reason there wasn't an endorsement was because Labour wouldn't protect press freedoms, which seemed like code for Labour not supporting press regulation enough. However, the I newspaper reported that there were private assurances given to the Murdoch newspapers or News UK executives that they wouldn't go ahead with Leveson 2 and that they would support the repeal of Section 40 of the
Crime and Courts Act.
Both of which Labour did do. So Labour did not include Leveson 2 in their manifesto.
Yeah.
And the new Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, has also suggested that they're not going to pursue it. And they did, in the wash-up in the final weeks of the last Parliament, back the repeal of Section 4. So that all stacks up. But what wasn't clear is whether that was an explicit deal
or simultaneous motion.
Or just a complete coincidence.
Yeah.
So I sort of tried to find out what the case was. Spoke to lots of Labour sources, Labour spokespeople, and asked repeatedly in different ways for a denial of this story that there had been this deal, and denial none there came. And instead, I got this rather sort of carefully worded statement suggesting that any policy decisions taken by the Labour government are taken in the country's interest, which doesn't preclude a deal.
It's complicated, isn't it? Because they could signal that we're going to repeal. They obviously didn't need to signal it. They voted to repeal Section 40 and didn't include it in the manifesto, which we published 3 weeks before the election. And, and knowing that would seek their favour, but there's no quid pro quo. It's difficult, isn't it, Hardeen, to nail that down.
Those are not the only two issues that News UK are interested in. So they're also interested in BBC, the future of the BBC, which Labour have recommitted themselves to the BBC licence fee, and the new Culture Secretary has recommitted herself to maintaining the licence fee. So I think it's possible that there was not necessarily an explicit deal, but the assurances were pursued with Starmer in his meetings on a number of issues, including Leveson, including the BBC, and the answers they got were not quite to their
So they've got some of it, so you get 2 endorsements, but the time holds back. It's so transactional. In fact, we know somebody who worked at the Times said it's completely transactional at that level. So if I was Lisa Nandy looking, and she made a big statement about the BBC, remind us of what's that famous incident, who related about Rupert Murdoch going to visit Boris Johnson and dandling his young son on the knee. And what does he say? This
was from Rachel Johnson, Boris Johnson's sister.
Who should know? Who
said that he was at a party with Rupert Murdoch dangling Johnson's son on his knee and urging him you have to get rid of the BBC. And we know Johnson, he didn't get rid of the BBC, but he was incredibly hostile to the BBC over the course of his premiership.
And in terms of priority, we have strong...
And suggested that the licence fee was going to end.
Yeah, so that was what Johnson said. In terms of Byline Times priorities, obviously our origin story relates a lot to Leveson 1, the inquiry after phone hacking into press ethics. A lot to what didn't happen in Leveson 2, which is the criminality, which was never investigated at the time because the trials, I was at the trials, the Daniel Morgan murder fits on that. And Byline.com and Byline Investigates were regulated by Impress, which is the official, the recognized independent. But then there's the BBC. If you were a politician and you had a choice between which three you were going to do, what would you prioritize?
If I was Lisa Nandy.
Yeah. If you could only do one of those three things.
I mean, I think it's interesting that they moved to develop more of a conciliatory approach towards the BBC. It's the renowned public service broadcaster. Its reputation, while it's taken a massive hit in recent years, is still surpassed in terms of its reach with the general public. So
part of our soft power as well.
It's part of the soft power. So it makes sense, actually, to be more positive towards the BBC. This notion of whatever conversations have happened behind the scenes. I mean, it seems reading between the lines that there has been some notion of, look, as you say, Peter, where we're going to have to pursue some things that we want. We won't do the second part of the Leveson inquiry, which will keep some of you quiet and happy. And maybe that's in the interest of the country because that means that we can get a lot of our agenda done without constant headlines and constant attempts at interference from the newspapers. Of course, there's a whole other conversation about how important those newspapers are now and what their influence is, and we could devote another entire podcast just to that. But for me, it introduced an interesting question, which I put to you in our weekly news meeting, which was, even if it's not an explicit deal, there may be an implicit understanding. And even the fact that is the case, what does that say about our political system and our democracy? That even if it seems that by not doing Leveson 2, there may be a situation where the press allows Labour to quietly get on with its agenda in some key areas. But at what cost does that come at? And Leveson 2, while I do think, that was the second part of the Leveson inquiry that was meant to look specifically at the relationships between the press, politicians, and the police.
The criminal ones,
the criminal ones. I mean, arguably, that should still happen. There's always the argument made that these things were in the past. The phone hacking scandal was 2011 to 12. It's a very long time ago now. Things have moved on. Things have progressed within the media world. Social media is now a big thing. Online publications, the advertising model, tech platforms, social media, all of that is now part of the picture. But I don't think this notion that newspaper editors in this country who have had a lot of power, who allegedly knew about phone hacking and the consequences of that are still coming out with various court cases, Prince Harry, Doreen Lawrence. I'm not sure that can just be swept under the carpet. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if it is a deal, even if it's for the best of the country,
so yes.
Is that something, how should we be approaching that? Because any notion of a deal with the media is, to my sense, problematic in a democracy.
So when I was at the phone hacking trial, I learned that, because it was a trial about conspiracy, criminal conspiracy, and a conspiracy can be tacit. It can be a silent conspiracy or silence. So to conclude this week, after this sort of exciting stuff from America...
Just what do you think on that point, Peter?
Well, I was just going to...
Okay.
Thank you for asking me. It's nice to be asked.
Yeah.
But bad symptoms of Blairism, as you point out, this authoritarian streak, actually more authoritarian than Blair in the removing of the whip. And Tony Blair did not need to go and court Rupert Murdoch in 1994 and fly to Hayward's Island and because he would have won anyway. But it got so close, he became godfather to Rupert Murdoch's children with Wendy Dame, constantly partying in and out of News UK headquarters, him and Rebecca Brooks. It was like, all these ministers, Blunkett. I don't think we'll see the return to that, but there's an ominous hint, right? But I would say one thing Starmer's been quite good at, and maybe this is a barrister's trick, going, fight them over there, and meanwhile coming out the back, doing something else. For example, everybody thought this was going to be a very centre-right, almost manifesto. It's turned out to be quite left-wing. There are two other routes, which I've always thought more important than press regulation. That's ownership. We allow foreign ownership in a way America would never do. We allow monopolies in a way that America used not to. And we have the Telegraph up for sale. We have various things we could do about foreign ownership. So that could be interesting. And, of course, another way of doing Leveson 2, rather than a public inquiry, is to reopen police inquiries into people like Piers Morgan, which is obviously the Mirror Group, which was involved. And Gordon Brown is pushing for that. So maybe I'm just being skeptical about my own cynicism here. There may be other routes, but I will say that the only way that we can make sure that the right things happen, we keep on pushing them to happen. We criticize them, and Adam does these investigations to find if they've done a deal, and we'll keep digging.
And we'll certainly be tracking this relationship. The new Labour government, it's been a matter of weeks. It's still going to be navigating for some time its relationship with the press. We will continue to track that. And I guess my final thought on this is, and we'll keep coming back to this, how influential, when we talk about the media, it encompasses quite a large number of online publications, social media, traditional newspapers. I guess when we talk about the press, or how we have always been referring to them under the Conservative governments with this merger, is these few right-leaning, very established newspapers. And I guess the question that we are going to keep asking is, what is their influence now? And is it that the implicit deal is, well, we won't write bad headlines about these policies? Or is it, well, if you do something we don't like, we'll start putting Angela Rayner on the front page, and Lord Ashcroft will start raising questions about. What I'm trying to say is, the days of hacking are behind us. So the notion of sex scandals about Keir Starmer or anything like that, there are none to our knowledge. I'm not suggesting there are, but if that's not the thing that is the compromat, then what is it? And would that even matter these days? And I think that is a really interesting moment as we navigate all of that.
I think there is this institutional memory in the Labour Party of how influential these newspapers have been in the past. You look back to 1992 and how Kinnock was treated by the Sun, and this idea that it's the Sun what won it. And I think that's kind of still lingers, even as newspapers are closing down, as the Evening Standard is closing down its daily edition. And so I think that the calculation that they may have made is that we've got so much on our plate in this government, we've got so many challenges, so long after the hacking scandal. Is this really going to be our priority? And I think across the board, there has been a kind of winning down of sort of fights that Starmer wants to pick. I think the problem with that analysis is that it may not matter so much now when Labour is at the peak of its powers, but could the press still cause him problems at the next general election or the general election after? It's not just the press, the sort of the wider media in whatever form it is.
And I guess it's not just the partisan thing about causing him problems, but for example, the country. I mean, say, for example, there is a merger between the Farage reformists and the Suella Braverman wing of the Conservative Party. It becomes still a different version of the Conservative Party, which is what Peter Oborne is warning against, becomes sort of a mainstream far-right, hard-right party. Then, as you say, Adam, what's to stop all those same newspapers that have bided their time then coming straight back into action? That merger once again comes into place. And what we have again is these distortions of our politics that we've seen, especially in the last 15 years, from in so many different ways. So I think Adam's right that actually there is a point of principle here, that the thing that might not matter to him as a politician, I think it matters for the country, it matters for our democracy.
And we will make sure he knows that, and the whole Labour Party does, and the country does. And let's not forget, it's not just about the ups and downs of the greasy pole of politics. Thanks to lobbying by the Telegraph and The Spectator, Boris Johnson refused to lock down early in the winter of 2020. And they had a second wave, killed another 120,000 people because he didn't lock down which Keir Starmer had argued for, an October circuit breaker. So it's not just about the fate of politicians. bad press kills people. On that jolly note, we will be back hopefully next Friday. You never know what's going to happen. This is, as I said, actually recorded on Wednesday. It's going out as our Friday live show. We're at WOMAD. We'll be doing the Bad Press Awards and things like that there. If we get anything wrong, if things have changed, forgive us. And otherwise, we'll see you again next week.